The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with, even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the third day of this session here in February 2020 at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico, on a day they can't decide whether it's going to rain or snow or be sunny or what. It's been all of these, and it seems like it's going to continue to be so, at least into tomorrow. And I'd like to continue sharing some of the teachings of a Nepali Tibetan, or Tibetan Nepali, I guess is what he calls himself. He's Tibetan heritage, but born in Nepal, named Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche. He's a young teacher, not yet 40, I don't think, and seems to have an uncanny ability to communicate with English-speaking people. Probably he grew up speaking English. His English is quite excellent, and yet he also grew up within the framework of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, very deeply so. He's known as a tulku, which is a person who is recognized as a reincarnation of someone who was a lineage holder. In other words, somebody quite revered, quite well-known, quite deep in their ability to teach and practice, someone who is the head of a lineage or close to the head of a lineage. And that is what he is. His father also was considered that. And his father died as the abbot of a tiny little nunnery in Nepal. It doesn't say much about his mother, but his father was his first teacher. And one of the first things his father asked him when he was beginning his training with his father, his Buddhist trainings with father, he says, "Are you Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche?" And this little 9-year-old boy said, "Yes." And then his father said, "Can you show me one thing that is Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche?" And at that, he set out on a quest that he's probably still on. That's our quest too. We have an identity that we have formed through context, through our culture, through our families, through our schooling, and so on and so forth. And most people, when they're asked who they are, they'll say, "Oh, well, I'm an engineer," or "I'm a teacher," or "I'm 13 years old," or "I have a baby sister and an older brother, and my father works at such and such a place, and my mother does thus and so." But is that who we are? He goes into this a little bit in this book called In Love with the World, A Monk's Journey Through the Bardos of Living and Dying. The background of this book is that he's already 36 years old, an abbot with international teaching responsibilities and several monasteries that he's in charge of. And he has, since he was a kid, wanted to go on a wandering pilgrimage, just anonymous, just experiencing life moment to moment, instead of within the confines of the monastery, within the confines of his exalted rank and his privileges and his the expectations of him, his teaching schedule, his students, and so on and so forth. And finally, when he's 36 years old, he has managed to do what his father had encouraged him to do, which was to strike out alone and find out who he really is. He already had a very strong inkling, and he expresses this here in this book. By the time I set off for this retreat, I understood the value of the labels shifts according to circumstances and social consensus. Who we are shifts, as he said, according to social circumstances and other circumstances. It shifts just throughout our life. We're a 3-year-old. Then we start our first day at school. Suddenly we're a kindergartner. And then maybe we've got a sibling in the family, a new sibling, and so we're an older brother or sister. And maybe a parent dies, and so we're half orphaned. And maybe that doesn't happen. Maybe we live a life of great happiness and wealth and security. And then suddenly the main person who is providing for us dies or loses his job or something like that happens, and suddenly we're something else. Then who is the real me? This is a vital question to ask. It's not just an intellectual task. In fact, it shouldn't be an intellectual task. It's something that has to be asked beyond words within ourselves, because when we find out, even get half a glimpse of it, things change in a very different way. Our priorities rearrange themselves. A load of stress drops. This is why people have sought enlightenment, awakening, whatever you want to call it, since well before the time of the Buddha. He continues. By the time I set off for this retreat, I understood that the value of the labels shifts according to circumstances and social consensus. I had already affirmed that I was not my name, title, or status, that the essential me could not be defined by rank or role. Nonetheless, these same designations, empty of essential meaning, had circumscribed my days. I'm a monk, a son, a brother, and an uncle, a Buddhist, a meditation teacher, a tulku, an abbot, and an author, a Tibetan Nepali, a human being. Which one describes the essential me? Making this list is a simple exercise. We can all do that. There's only one problem. The inevitable conclusion contradicts every cherished assumption that we hold dear, as I was just about to learn yet again. I wish to go beyond the relative self, the self that identifies with the labels. I knew that even though those social categories play a dominant role in our personal stories, they coexist with a larger reality beyond labels. And it is this larger reality that offers us the most amazing freedom we can even imagine. In fact, we can't imagine it. It's beyond imagining. This is why people have been drawn to spiritual practice for ever since time began, it seems like. Some of it, of course, is to be free of suffering. And that's fundamental, really. But who are we? Are we this person that wears these particular clothes that designate a particular rank in society, a status in life, a function? What happens to us when we die? When all of that has to be let go of. And this is probably why many people are afraid of dying. It's a great, vast unknown. And unknowns, for many people, are quite fearful. Who are we? What will happen when we die? Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche, at this part of the writing of the book, is about to set off. Actually, he has already set off. He was living in Bodhgaya in a monastery and planned for a couple of years how he would, in essence, make his escape, because he was so protected and he had never gone anywhere without an attendant. He was known, he was wearing Buddhist robes, he was easily identified as Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche. How would it be to go completely anonymously? And given his status, it was not possible for him to do that. Just as the Buddha had left his enclave, his compound, at a certain point in his life, secretly, so that nobody could pull him back. So Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche set out on a pilgrimage. He planned to do it for 4 years. He nearly died. In fact, he came so close to death that he had actually had a near-death experience from severe food poisoning. He set out to offer himself to whatever experience might come forth, completely dependent on whatever was there for him in a given moment. It took a little bit of transition for him. He wasn't initially ready to take off his Buddhist robes. And his first night, instead of sleeping on the floor in the train station with the other beggars, he rented himself a cheap hotel room. It took a little courage for him to step out into anonymity, into what? The unknown. And yet this is what each one of us do as we die. We step into the unknown. The only thing accompanying us is our karma, how we have lived in this life, how we have lived in previous lives as well. It's cumulative. The Tibetan Buddhists have gone at great lengths for a very long time in their concern with dying, not fear of dying, but concern with dying, that the dying be as positive and positively effective as possible, given that there's a very strong belief in rebirth in Tibetan Buddhism. In Buddhism in general, there's a certain level of assumption around rebirth, but it's not necessary to believe in this. You don't have to if you don't want to. You can simply do the meditation and reach deeply within yourself, trying to find out who you really are, beyond the name, beyond the clothes, beyond the profession, beyond the history, because eventually you will, as the saying goes, walk nakedly into the night. Who are you? Who are you? It is so vital to find out before you take that long walk into the dark. it's pretty classic when some aspect of a person's identity suddenly is lost through disaster, through loss of a job, through death, whatever, that it can truly shake a person up. But was that who they were? It can be so intense that people actually commit suicide rather than face life without that identity. When the stock market crashed in the into the 1920s, stockbrokers literally threw themselves out of the windows of the stock exchanges, preferring violent death over the loss of identity or the sense of failure, which again is a loss of identity. What is so fearsome about this self-identity? Why do we cling to it? Who are we without it? It's worth taking a good, long, wordless look in an ongoing manner to find out. You may be surprised. It could be the most amazing thing you've ever experienced in your whole life. And there is some sense of this. Otherwise, people would not sit unmoving for periods of time daily, and in particular in sesshin or meditation retreat, if there wasn't some sense that there was something worth uncovering, something worth reaching. And Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche had understood a great deal already before he chose to leave the monastery and go strike out on his own, anonymous, and trust the universe. But he felt he still hadn't got it all understood. Here he writes, I'd developed some capacity to hold the relative and absolute perspectives at the same time. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Yet I'd never known a day without people and props that mirrored the stitched together patchwork that became known to me and to others as Mingyur Rinpoche. Unfailingly polite, quick to smile, with a somewhat reserved demeanor, tidy, clean-shaven, wearing rimless glasses with gold frames. Now I wondered how these identities would play out in the Gaya station. He had set out from Bodh Gaya in a taxi, and he was at the Gaya train station waiting for a train to Varanasi. I've been there many times before, but it always with at least one attendant. This meant that I was never without a reference to rank and was never challenged to depend solely on my own internal resources. Tibetans have an expression for deliberately increasing the challenge of maintaining a steady mind, adding wood to the fire. Generally, people go through life taking note of those experiences that recurrently inflame our anger or anxiety or fear, and then we try to avoid them, telling ourselves things like, I don't watch scary movies. I cannot be in a big crowd. I have a terrible fear of heights, or of flying, or of dogs, or of the dark. But the causes that provoke these responses do not go away. And when we find ourselves in these situations, our reactions can overwhelm us. Using our inner resources to work with these issues is our only true protection, because external circumstances change all the time and are therefore not reliable. And that is the nature of life, really. Everything has changed. There is nothing that is reliable, other than the fact that everything's going to change. So who are you? Find out. Become free. Surf the change. Flow with the wind. Unfurl your true self and soar, free, able to offer immense help to suffering beings. Is that not the purpose of our life? I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.